Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation that I'm having with James Heywood, the Off to Class head of content and co-founder. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Hi, Chris. Good to
Hello,
be
I'm so
here.
glad you're here. Yeah, so what we're going to be talking about today is speaking. Speaking. Teachers feel good about teaching speaking. When students say they need to learn grammar, sometimes teachers go, "Oh, I don't know about grammar so much," but every teacher feels confident about teaching, about speaking. But here's the problem. Teachers often view English in terms of four skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. That is the very beginning. And there is so much more to speaking. And one of the ways that you can communicate value to your students is by going a little deeper. You don't just practice speaking and have a conversation with your student and then say, "I taught you speaking today." There's more to speaking. There's fluency and coherence. There's accuracy. There's intonation and stress. There's pronunciation. There's register. And you can really show your student how you're going to help them by learning these skills and going deeper into these skills and learning which of these speaking skills your students need the most. And so, especially for teachers who are new, who aren't really sure about how to give students confidence to make them feel good about you as a teacher. One of the best ways to do that is to know what you're talking about, is to be able to go deeper than just saying, "I'm going to teach you speaking, reading, listening, and writing," but to actually say, "We're going to dig into the speaking," because most students prioritize speaking over the other skills naturally. But today, James is going to be going into detail about speaking skills, how you can do a better job of teaching those speaking skills with the Off the Class curriculum. So James, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that was a great introduction, and I think it is something that perhaps teachers don't think about. We think about the other skills that we need to teach more actively than we do with speaking, but because it's a production skill, we do get perhaps more excited when we see students produce that, and we think, okay, task finished, they've answered the question, let's move on. And so what I'm going to do is today, I hope, is to give you some ideas around for teachers who perhaps need a bit of a refresher, but for less experienced teachers using the Off the Class curriculum, some ideas around teaching speaking skills when perhaps they're not actually in the middle of a speaking activity in the course itself, but perhaps now is the right time to do it. And I think, to your point, Chris, one of the things that we should always do is think about the purpose of what we're doing. Sometimes it's very easy when students appear to be proficient, or when they're just saying anything, to think that, okay, you do get a bit of a good feeling, because that's really what students want to do. They want to be able to speak the language, but there's a lot of other different skills that there are skills that need to be looked at and taught. And so that's what I hope to go with you today, cover today. So in terms of, before I start, one of the things I just want to mention is not all students are confident speakers. Not everybody is a natural talker. And I think as a teacher, that's something that you need to be very aware of, because teachers tend to be very strong verbal communicators, and it can actually be quite a frustrating experience when we know that the student knows or has understood our task or our question, but they just actually don't have the confidence to respond. So confidence and motivation are two things that you can really work on with a lot of students who perhaps are reticent to speak. It's not something that's easily resolved, but I think it's something that you should keep in the back of your mind that might not be related actually to the student's proficiency, but rather to their personality type. And as I said, to reiterate, the fact is that most teachers, we are verbally, strong verbal communicators, and we're not always aware of that. So the things that I want to go over, there are more speaking skills than those that I've listed here today. But what I'm going to cover is that, what I want to highlight really is, things about when you set up a task, a speaking task, you do want to have a goal for that task, and what exactly are you going to concentrate? It's rare that you can have the time or the scope to be able to go over all of these. So when you're setting up a task, think about what it is you actually want the skill to be for the student. So there is both fluency and coherence. The idea of the student isn't just pushing out any words, but perhaps if you can get them to slow down the pace at which they're talking, they can concentrate a bit more to actually be more fluent, to use the correct words in the correct context, and to avoid having to restart, endless sentences without endings to them, and to be coherent, which is obviously to speak in a logical manner with ideas produced in a logical way that would follow on. So, for example, students might like to you might like to introduce a task where you're getting them to summarize something. So you would have they might be summarizing a reading activity that they've just done. You're asking to give them a verbal summary of it. So you want to make sure that it's coherent in the sense that they present a main point, or they paraphrase the question, and then they introduce, the supporting evidence for that. Very similar to how you would set up a writing activity. The other one is accuracy. There are moments when you want to focus on the accuracy of using verb tenses, for example, but there are other times where accuracy is not really what you're after here. You want the student to use the vocabulary in context, and the verbs and the prepositions and the articles just have to go a little bit by the wayside. And that's a good point for me to go back to the writing that we talked about. When you're setting up a teaching task and you're wanting to correct, if you choose accuracy as the goal, then you want to be careful about the number of times, when and how often are you going to either interrupt or correct the student. That's something you really need to be careful about, because even again, as native speakers, we often start, we will go back, we'll stop ourselves, we'll paraphrase, and the reality is that a lot of actual fluent, coherent native speech is basically broken, a whole bunch of broken sentences with context thrown in there. So keep in mind that although you want to move for accuracy, there's a limit to even how much that operates with native speakers in real life. How long have you actually got up there, and when was the last time as a public speaker you had to speak for 20 minutes or even a few minutes without interruption in a coherent manner? It's rare, because there's natural conversation is probably the most prominent way that we speak. Another couple of things, if you are a fairly experienced teacher or your students may ask you, there are a couple of things, intonation and stress and pronunciation. I think while they're both extremely important, they're areas that you want to be really careful about. I wouldn't say they go into the science of language, but you want to be quite knowledgeable if you're going to start teaching pronunciation. Words produced in isolation are very different to how they sound in connected or fast speech. And if you want to start breaking it down like that into the phonemes, you really need to know your stuff. So I would say not that you should avoid pronunciation, you should always assist with students, but setting up an entire task where you're listening for pronunciation probably requires you to have an understanding of the basics of phonetics and how intonation and stress pronunciation change according to the speed of the speech. So a couple of things to think about there. And finally, register is an important one as well. All of us as native speakers, we speak very differently in a formal environment, or well, hopefully we speak differently to when we speak to somebody formal, in a formal manner, perhaps to a stranger on the street, to an elderly person, a person who is a superior in the sense that we might need something from them. Very different to how we speak with our friends, children, animals, and the classic case perhaps is languages in which the you singular and you plural are very distinct. both grammatically and syntactically, while in English we do have the you singular and the you plural, but there is no difference in form, which can mean that there are other ways in which we will communicate the informality or the formality, especially around, again, intonation, stress, and also for English, the vocabulary. So going on to the speaking skills in non-speaking tasks, I'm going to show you some examples.
Can I come in here, James? I want to ask you a thing or two, because I think this is really interesting, and I want to maybe dig a little bit deeper into these specific skills so that teachers can really apply them more to their specific circumstances. So the first question that I want to ask you is, when I look at this slide that you've shared, I see intonation and stress and pronunciation on different lines. So the first question is, what is the difference between intonation and pronunciation? Why are these treated as separate skills? Because I think a lot of teachers tend to lump these things into like pronunciation and intonation together.
They all belong together, if you like, but when I think of pronunciation, I do think more of words in isolation and how you would break a word down to its individual phonemes. I guess the classic way of students teaching pronunciation for themselves is to look up the dictionary, and if they know the actually, you don't need to know the International Phonetic Alphabet anymore, because an online dictionary will have a speaker icon next to it that, in fact, you can press and it will push it out in either Australian, British, or American English, if not something else these days. And that's how I view pronunciation, is perhaps words in isolation. However, intonation and stress are a where you look at larger chunks of speech. And for example, we have particular intonation when it comes to questions. Yes/no questions in English generally go down at the end, while an information question will go up at the end. That's not entirely true across the world now, as we tend to all be moving towards I can't remember what the actual name of the effect is now, but we're all moving towards that uplifting intonation at the end of a sentence. But it generally used to be something different. So I would say that pronunciation is more looking at how we pronounce a word in isolation, while intonation and stress is more about getting, looking at larger chunks of speaking over and the purpose for which we're speaking. We often stress particular words when we do want to emphasize or highlight something in our speech. A good example of that is how you can ask a regular information question in English and change the stress on a particular word to change the focus of the question itself. Is that okay?
Yeah, and of course, changing the stress changes the entire meaning, right? Like there's the famous sentence that says, "I didn't say he stole the money."
You got it.
Where I didn't say he stole the money, it's one meaning. I didn't say. Stressing each word makes a different meaning. My students find that exercise fascinating. And that's so demonstrative to show them why stress matters. Because you take the same words, stressing a different word makes the sentence change completely in its meaning. So I think one question I have here is that, again, looking at this list of skills, a student cannot come to a teacher and say, "Hi, teacher, my accuracy is okay, but I really need help with my fluency and coherence. My pronunciation is okay, and then another thing I need extra help with is my register," right? Students don't know this. All a student is going to be able to say is, "I need help speaking." How can teachers dig into this and actually parse out what a student really needs when a student, like almost all students, says, "I need help with my speaking skills"?
Sure. Okay. Well, I'll go into that. I'm just going to add one note to what you've said. I know that there are students who do come after, and I can't remember what the actual terminology, what it's actually called now, but there are students who often feel that they need particular assistance with their pronunciation. And I have seen teachers who specialize, I believe, I don't know the correct term for it at the moment. I don't really like the one I'm about to use, but I think it's called accent correction. I know that there are people who've spoken and who can speak much better on this topic than I do, but there are, I believe, teachers who specialize in helping people perhaps achieve let's call it a more natural, native, I don't even like using that term, but a more native accent. I think really what students are trying to do there is actually improve the comprehensibility for the other person, and there is no doubt that depending on the language, L1, the mother tongue that the student has, bringing that over into English with a completely different phonetic set can be quite challenging. Obviously, for some languages, it's much easier. I'm going to do a real kind of stereotype here, but I would say that on the whole, it's easier for students of a Western European Romance language to have perhaps a more comprehensible accent in English, or faster than it is in general for people perhaps speaking an Asian language. I don't want to use that as a stereotype, but that is something I believe that is something. And there are teachers who specialize in kind of assisting with pronunciation.
Yeah, I want to tangent with you just a tiny bit on this because I think this topic is important and it is problematic. One of the most gifted accent teachers that I know does not have an ESL background. Her name is Annie Rudin, and she was a speech therapist, and so that's her professional background. And her whole thing is not, she says, listen, if you need help with the language, that's not what I'm here to help you with. The only thing I'm here to help you with is to sound more natural when you speak. But this accent reduction, yes, it's very problematic, because when students come to a teacher and they say, I want to sound like a native speaker, right? That's a typical thing that a student might say. The first question is, well, why? Because what they're really looking for is to be accepted in an environment.
Absolutely.
And so you can go deeper and be like, well, what environment are you actually in? And let's help you work on that. And the second thing is, which native, right? Because I'm a native speaker from the United States. You're a native speaker from Australia. We say things very different. And, just context for people watching this, James freezes all the time, and I have to stop him. And I say, what did you say? Because that doesn't make any sense to me. We have another colleague on the team who's from England. She says things that I don't understand. And I'm in the United States, and Off to Class is in Canada. The Canadian speakers, English speakers at Off to Class say things that I don't understand. They said, Chris, he said, and Bob's your uncle. And I said, who's my uncle? Who's Bob? Why is Bob my uncle? And we're native speakers, right? And the other thing is, like, not only which native do you want to sound like, but native from where?
Yeah.
People in Florida sound very different from people in Chicago, from people in New York. And there's so many sub-dialects that it can be very tricky. So I always focus on intelligibility. That's kind of see, I'm going to use an idiom now. That's the drum that I pound, which, look, I try to use fewer idioms when I'm speaking to learners.
Sure.
Because they unnecessarily complicate the communication. But I think it's really important to just focus on intelligibility and not less on accent. Number one, because, well, accents are just becoming more and more a part of life. They're becoming more accepted. And this is the other part that I think is so tricky about accents. The ability to mimic an accent is as varied as how tall people are. Some people are very tall, some people are very short, and short people cannot change their height. And tall people cannot become shorter if they want to. Some people, and I don't know why, they have this innate ability to hear a different accent with completely different phonemes and make those sounds immediately. And someone else may have been learning the language for 10 years. Someone else may be living in an immersion environment and still have those, like, be unable to escape their native phonemes. And so when people say, I want to have a more native accent, the reason I always try to steer people away from that is because you might not be able to do it at all. Because I know if I teach you English, for a certain period, for a certain number of minutes at a certain schedule, we can make predictable improvement, right? Accent is not that way. We could spend hours working on changing your accent, and all it can lead to for some people is frustration, feeling like I can't do this. So this is like a whole. I know I went pretty deep into this, but this is like it's a very interesting part of speaking, and I think it's something that teachers need to be aware of, because students will come and they'll say, I want to sound more like a native speaker, and the teacher says, oh yeah, absolutely, I can help with that. And what they're really doing is they're just saying, I'm gonna make you sound more like me. You know, these are this very specific ways that I say things based on where I'm from and the context that I'm in. So I think it's just something that teachers should be aware of, because most of the English that's spoken in the world is from one non-native to another non-native, and the intelligibility aspect, making sure that you're understood by natives and by non-natives, is so much more important than sounding like one specific group of people, with the only exception being if someone is like, I live in this particular environment around native speakers and they don't respect me because of the way I speak. That's like the only circumstance that I will say to somebody, okay, I will help you sound more like an American. And I only do it for Americans. I can't help someone sound more like an Australian.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting topic, and I want to let you get back to the things that you were saying, but I'm glad that it's something that we can address, because I want more teachers to be aware of it.
I think so. You know, we could do a webinar on this one, and I think one of the really important points that you brought up is that actually things around accent improvement or intelligibility, if there really is an issue, it could be as much a speech pathologist's. I think that's what you said, because those people understand from a physiological point of view where the sounds are pronounced in the mouth. And even if that's where you need to actually start breaking it down, because a student who reads using the Roman letters in another language has a particular way. When they see the letter T, they will pronounce it, you know, it's a dental, and is it? And so they will pronounce it, their body will pronounce it, you know, without reflexively in a particular area in their mouth. And it's very, very hard to unlearn or to learn a new way to pronounce the letter T, which will change also depending on, you know, whether that's also followed by a consonant or a vowel sound, each of which have special places to be already pronounced. It's just such a reflex action. It's so hard to do it. And so I think it is for English teachers, you do need to have special skills before you go down that path. Like you also said, the goals of the students really, when they're talking about, I want to improve my accent, generally in 90% of cases, they want to improve their level of intelligibility. And one of the things that I always come back with, you know, well, not always, sorry, I have had in the past Indian students come to me who actually speak English fluently, but yet without a doubt, there are many different Indian Englishes, if I can say that.
You can.
And it's not just based around the accent, they have a different way of using tenses. I've noticed that, I don't know scientifically, but I know that, for example, the continuous tenses are perhaps used more often in Indian English. But that's not something you should change, because the reality is there are probably 25 native Australian English speakers in the world. India probably has 300. I don't know. There's probably half a billion people speaking Indian English who understand each other perfectly well.
Absolutely.
And so it could be a bit of a non-issue.
And Indian English is recognized, right? So just because someone is from India and speaks Indian English, I'm not going to correct them, because, well, that's not how we say it in the United States, unless they are living and working in the United States and need to make sure that their communication is clear there. But if they are somewhere else and communicating with other international colleagues, it's not something to correct.
Yeah, I think a lot of teachers watching this, I know we've gone a little bit off the speaking skills, excuse me, discussion already. It is certainly relative. I'm sure a lot of teachers will have interesting comments to make about that, and perhaps it's even a discussion we can have in the future, because another thing is that, you know, there is an international English that exists somewhere in the realm between what you and I both speak, but it's neither Australian, British, American English. It's just something else. And that's really the international English, or that level of intelligibility, is what needs to be taught and understood and spoken today.
Yes.
So I'll get back to
Yeah,
this.
go ahead. Sorry.
One of the things I wanted, so one of the focus of this webinar is to show you, especially teachers who are using the off the class curriculum materials, some ideas about introducing speaking skills if you are dealing with a non-speaking task. So the first and most obvious one is that every picture, every image, we have a very image-heavy lesson library, and we have chosen those images for specific reasons. Hopefully they will student with every image being worth 1,000 words or more. There's ample opportunities there. So that's a pretty obvious one, which I don't feel that I need to go in and speak about at greater length. But the other one I want to bring you up with is, as we said, speaking for speaking's sake may not actually really be doing a lot for the student's learning itself. So if you're going to do a speaking activity or a task using some of our materials that are not necessarily focused on that, you still need to set up the task and create the context. Because if you set up the task, the student knows what you're expecting them to do. One of the hardest things for students to do is just talk about something. They don't always have the personal interest in it, and they may not have experience in what you're about to ask them to do. So it's really important that you set up that task and create the context. And I think, again, because teachers are strong verbal communicators, we think it's really easy, show anybody anything and they can talk about it. But a lot of people will give you, if you ask them a question, they'll go yes and no, or no, and that will be the end of the question. They won't follow on from it. So that's something you really need to do. The other thing you can do to improve speaking skills, if you want to have a successful speaking skill, is personalize the context for the student. Anytime, and this is why it's really good if you have students over a long period of time, is to, whether you make mental notes or you write them down like I do, what are the students' interests? What pieces of information have you gleaned over time about that student that will make a particular speaking task interesting for them? How can you personalize anything that they've told you? Any personal information you have about them, obviously that you're keeping private, but in a classroom environment, is there any of that that you can use to personalize a context? Because it's easier to talk about experiences that we've had or that we would like to have than talking about something which the student has little or no interest in. And the other thing, if you really want to be successful with speaking skills, I honestly believe that teachers need to be actors, and you need to enthuse the students to role play. And that, again, can be really tough depending on the context level. It can also be something related to the student's own personality. Some students find it really childish to do a role play, that it can become more difficult in classes with large groups of students to do role plays. But don't underestimate by pulling yourself out of the experience. If you've got a class with multiple students and have the students do the role play, often it's easier for them to do it than with the native speaker who has no problems whatsoever. So going into some of the examples that I want to show you, I've just picked some non-speaking tasks or non-speaking slides from our lesson material to give you a general idea of some basic ideas around what you could do. So now that I've clicked that hasn't worked. Oops. Okay, so excuse me. Here we're actually in a pre-listening activity. It's from the A1, so it's at a very basic. That's the first A1 proficiency, beginners. So this would be about 25 lessons perhaps into a student's course from an absolute beginner. And you've got a nice bright image here, and the students are doing a pre-listening activity by asking them some questions. Now, you might pick here, as we've chosen this particular topic. Almost everybody in the world has a phone and a smartphone these days, if not one or two. Most people definitely have internet-connected devices, and we all take selfies. So this is a great opportunity, if you feel to do so, to provide even as a pre-listening activity. You could set this one up. Here, actually, when I think about it, we haven't got a sales assistant and a customer. You've probably got two people who are searching for a phone, but you could use this context with the students to actually get them to act this out. You're going to buy a phone with your friend. You're going to recommend a phone to your friend. You can start setting up the task by, you're going to act this out in front of us, the conversation that you would have before the sales assistant comes over to you. What are you going to talk about? What are the things that you need to discuss? Here, for example, you could, if you have a phone that you actually, most people have a phone that they like, you can get them to talk about it. The person that they might be going to take to purchase the phone, take your mum. Okay, that's always a good example of having to explain something to somebody else. And you could set that task up and get them to present that to you before they even go on to the listening activity. And I think that's a valid way for them to start thinking about, even though they won't be, that they will be using language that they may then go on to hear in the listening activity that actually follows on from this. So I think that would be a good opportunity for them to speak by setting up a role play here, if you can. Another one here, this is taken from a more advanced writing activity where we are using continuous tenses to create suspense. So I think this is probably from the C1, if I remember. Yeah, it's one of the C1 activities. And in English, when an author writes, okay, here you can see they're all in the past continuous tense, but we build suspense and we create this kind of feeling using the past continuous to describe actions. So there are a whole lot of situations here. And although it's a writing activity at the end of this lesson, we've all been in uncomfortable situations. So you could get the students to talk among themselves, set up the task by saying you are recounting. Last night you had an uncomfortable experience. Set up what that experience was. You were stuck in a lift for 10 minutes. Sorry, lift elevator for, there's an example of Australian versus North American English.
Right.
Right? Okay, you understood though, right?
Yes, I did.
You were stuck somewhere for 10 minutes and you couldn't get out. A bit of suspense there, and you're going to recreate that as a telephone call between friends, or you get the students to do it with you. And as the teacher, obviously, you can be prepared with a whole bunch of like what happened next, and then and help them do that. And speaking that out is actually a really great way, although it doesn't occur in this lesson, as a pre-writing activity as well. I think that's really helpful. And you've already got the language modeled on the slide in front of you so that students can use that and even use some of those exact, doesn't matter if they're using some of those exact terms, start getting them to swap things around and think about it. Another activity here, this is actually a listening activity after which the students would then go in. So they're going to listen to Callum O'Connell. This is taken from one of my favorite lessons. It's the one where we introduced irregular past tense forms. So there's a whole lot here. And anyway, it's a bit of a murder mystery. But you're going to listen to Callum, who goes on and explains his side of the story to an inspector. But what you've actually got in front of you are a whole bunch of statements that are true or false. And irrespective of the listening activity that comes here, a great role play, and some students will really get into this, is throw yourself back to the entire context in which this takes place. It's sort of like a murder mystery. So we've given the various speakers different pronounced accents in this one. This dude is a kind of like American magnate, I think, from memory. So he speaks in a very particular way. And you've got these facts here. And this is a great example, if students enjoy that they could do without even listening to the true and false. You've got a bunch of facts right in front of you here, have them recreate the scene for you. And whether it's they do it just as a speech, or you can act as the inspector who also appears in this lesson, and you can have the interview right there and then, right? So that's a great opportunity for them, again, before the listening activity, because some of the vocabulary may come out that they can then be listening for in the activity itself. Reading often gives you a lot of opportunity to, here we've got a modeling. This is a reading activity. the lesson, I believe, finishes with a writing task. So what we've got here is a modeling of the writing activity itself. We've got questions and answers. So what you can do here is simply ask the students to look at the questions and then respond to them in a personal situation. Or if it's not reading habits, that might not be something that students particularly feel passionate about. You might get them to speak about their TV habits. I don't know what they're watching on Netflix. Try and keep the context personal, and as I said, personalize it based on the experience that you know that your students have. And then finally, excuse me, another one here from another reading activity is you've got an expression. It's actually a reading activity, but it will lead to a writing task at the end. There's no speaking activity here, but what you've got are some comprehension questions, and perhaps once you've been through there, you've got a written review, a fairly informal, you've got a written review by a student. Why not get them to think about how would you present this to the class? Because you would change the register of the language and you would make it more colloquial and friendly. So how would you do this? Give me a 1-minute summary that you're going to present to the class or present to another student. And obviously, Macbeth is not something that most of us, while it is obviously a masterpiece of English literature, it might not be something that we've enjoyed learning at school. It probably isn't something that is on most non-native speakers, or they probably don't read Shakespeare in the native language, perhaps in the translation. But regardless, you can quite easily change the text that's involved here and go with something like that. So that was to give you some basic ideas around using the material that already exists as a springboard, not always, but if you feel that there's an opportunity there for students to speak. And in each one of these, as I said, you would want to work out, as you set this up, are you looking for accuracy? Are you looking for coherence? What is it exactly that you're going to do so that it's not just speaking for speaking's sake? The last thing I want to mention, Chris, as always, the last thing with me, is watch out for teacher talk time when you do speaking activities. And I mention this because this is something I've always been reasonably guilty of as a teacher, is I have a habit of getting more excited perhaps than the students are when they're speaking. And that isn't necessary. I think that comes out more. Teacher talk time can come out more in speaking activities than in any other activity. And wanting to constantly prompt the student, it's important to know when to just let go. If the speaking activity doesn't work and you're already in a listening task or a writing task, it's okay to let that go as well. Yeah.
Teacher talk time is big, and I think it's, especially in speaking activities, it's very easy to forget that it's the amount of time the student spends speaking is the most important thing. And for me, this is now the third or fourth conversation like this that we've done. The way I kind of look at the theme of all of this, to sort of bring this into something cohesive, is I think one of the most important messages for teachers is that being a native English speaker does not make you a good English teacher. Being a native speaker does not make you an expert on the English language. I think it's just so easy for us as in native speaking teachers to say, I've been speaking English my whole life. That makes me an expert, but it doesn't. And you showing us these materials is a great example of it. I think of it like a doctor, okay? A beginner doctor, a doctor who doesn't know very much. If somebody comes in and says, my elbow hurts, you know, the doctor without as much experience or expertise is going to look at the elbow. But a doctor who is very experienced, who is very good, might look at that elbow and say, problem's not your elbow. Problem is actually in your shoulder, and it's causing a problem in the elbow. When we become more experienced and get more skills, we can go so much deeper than just, we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to improve your speaking. That's where using these skills that you're sharing, we can connect them to deeper things like fluency and coherence, register. The first step is awareness, because if you don't know that these different skills exist, then you can't teach them, you can't point them out to your students, and your students won't know they exist. So the first thing to do is to actually break down these 4 skills into their sub skills, and then you can open up conversations with your students on, what do you think your needs are? These are what I think as the teacher your needs are, and this is where we can have conversations to improve these things that are going to be more relevant to your situation, instead of just having conversation practice.
Absolutely, and I think, there are a lot of good teachers out there, and I think the very best of them understand that they still can know very little in the end about the entirety of the English language. Just life is too short, and language is far too rich for us to become experts in a short period of time. And I still make errors on things all the time when I teach, and there are certain areas that I've always avoided teaching because they don't, but I still have to do it. And I still have I still have books, as everybody should, reference books, have a couple of great reference books, but I think, to your point, always be aware that you will need to learn. It's continuous learning for teachers as well, and you will find, good teachers will understand that it's okay. I know people say, don't say to a student, I don't know. I think the thing was always to say, I'll get back to you about that later. I don't know. I think it's okay to tell students you don't know about really intricate points of the language. And I read a quote, and I feel bad that I'm going to misquote it, and B, I can't tell you the reference, but on a website the other day that was related to professional development for teachers, it talked about teachers who have been teaching for 20 years are great teachers. And the quote was something like, it said something like, you can have taught for 20 years, but you're either a good teacher or a bad teacher. Have you taught the same year for 20 years, or have you taught 20 different years? And the difference is, if you have learned new things all the time and tried to improve yourself, you have taught 20 different years, which has kept your profession interesting. If you've just gone in and repeated ad nauseum, which you're going to do until the end of your career, you're probably not that good.
Yeah, I agree.
It's something to that extent.
Okay, fantastic. So James, are we going to wrap it up, or is there any other final points or any other things you want to address?
No, I think I could go back to pronunciation, intonation, and stress for a long while, because we did talk about that, and I think that could be something for a future webinar. But no, let's wrap it up. Unless there's anything on the Facebook page now.
I've been responding to a couple of the comments, but that's kind of how we can end. If you have questions or would like to contribute to the discussion, please leave a comment. James will come back and address anything that's interesting. We have been presenting on specific skills. This is something we will continue, and as we go through, eventually there will be something that we have in writing that documents a lot of these conversations that we're having. So that's something that's coming up that you'll hear more about in the coming weeks and months. But James, it's always a pleasure, and I'm so glad that you are able to come on and help empower teachers to help them become better at what they do.
Thanks, guys, for attending. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. All right, we'll see everyone next time. Bye now.